Welcome to The Fully Mindful, where we explore what it means to live with intention, creativity, authenticity, and connection. I'm your host, Melissa Chereau, mindfulness and breathwork facilitator, neurodivergent lawyer and coach, and fellow human navigating this wild and beautiful ride we call life. On this podcast, we dive deep with interviews featuring inspiring guests, share solo mini episodes packed with guided mindfulness practices to help you center and thrive, and mix things up with tangents and sidebars, where my friend and fellow podcaster Debbie Harrell from the New World Normal joins me for some real, random, and meaningful conversations. So if you're ready to pause, reflect, and expand, you're in the right place. Let's get fully mindful. Hey everybody, it's Melissa Chereau with The Fully Mindful, and super excited today to have you listen in with my conversation with Stephanie Duesing, author of Eyeless Mind, a memoir about seeing and being seen, to talk about her harrowing journey getting a diagnosis of cerebral-cortical visual impairment, called CVI, a common form of blindness for her son when he was a teenager, and how she and her family experienced an incredible journey and paved the road for her mission to educate families on being advocates for themselves and others. We'll talk about the condition of CVI and how it's the most common form of visual impairment, and how her son navigated exceptionally through life with the love and support of his family, both before and after the diagnosis, how it took incredible perseverance to get the diagnosis, how Stephanie Duesing, a regular music teacher, made a major medical discovery, and how scientific research corroborated that discovery. We'll talk about paying attention to the helpers and trusting yourself, and how stumbling into what was a devastating discovery has catapulted Stephanie into advocacy in the CVI world, and how that impacts and helps other people every day. You're in for a super interesting and inspiring conversation. Make sure to check out the show notes for getting in touch with Stephanie and learning more. Thank you so much. See you on the other side. All right. All right. Well, here we are. We're live. We're recording. We're here with The Fully Mindful, and I'm very happy to have with me here today Stephanie Duesing. She is, well, we're going to find out all about her, but she is an author, an advocate, and an extraordinary woman. And I want to let her tell the details. And so we'll just dive in. I know, Stephanie, you and I talked before about your work specifically around, and you're going to have to remind me, but I think I'm getting this right, cortical verbal impairment. Do I have that right?
You're close. Thank you.
I'm close.
Yes. I'm an advocate, a speaker, and an author on the topic of cerebral/cortical visual impairment. And I talk a lot about verbal mediation as a compensatory strategy. So you kind of got both of those ideas into one. So congratulations.
I blended them. That's probably my ADD, is I just think everything's related. So
you know what
thank
it all
you
is.
for being gracious about that. And so tell us, before we dive into the book that you wrote and the advocacy that you do and the work that you do, tell us a little bit about your background, like where you grew up and what you do professionally and with your family and that sort of thing.
Well, thank you. So I grew up all over the place. I'm actually a survivor of life-threatening child abuse, and my mother had Munchausen by proxy, and she repeatedly and deliberately abandoned me beginning when I was 4 years old. And I had siblings, and we would move approximately every 2 years across the country, usually, in fact, always in the middle of the school year, into a new home on a Saturday. And then on Monday, I would go to a new school that I'd never been to in a neighborhood I was totally unfamiliar with. And my mother would always pick up my siblings from whatever schools they were at. And just by our ages, they always happened to be in different school buildings than I was in. It just worked out that way. And so beginning when I was 4, I was always the one who didn't get picked up. And I came home from my first day of kindergarten in a squad car. So you can imagine, it's actually a miracle, I think, that I survived my childhood. I was almost kidnapped when I was 6. So so that's my background.
I'm going to interrupt you for just a second. Not everybody knows I know what it is, but not everybody knows what Munchausen's by proxy is. Can you tell us what that is?
That's a great question. Thanks for asking. So, Munchausen by proxy is a very severe condition where a parent, usually a mother, I think, deliberately harms or injures or makes their child ill in order to get attention and sympathy. And so, for my mom, abandoning me was a way for her to get a lot of attention and sympathy. And yeah, so it was it was a very scary upbringing.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly being brought home at the age of 4 in a squad car will bring some attention.
It
That's for sure.
certainly will, and it certainly did. I have vivid memories of it, even as a 4-year-old. So, to go on to answer your question, I am a survivor of life threatening child abuse, but that's not what I focus on. To be honest, I'm actually a former music teacher. I taught middle school music and chorus for 10 years, and then I became an early childhood music and movement specialist after taking some time off when my son was born. So then after that, I became an author. I'm the author of a book called Eyeless Mind, a memoir about seeing and being seen, which is actually the true story of how I, an ordinary music teacher, made a major medical discovery in the field of visual neuroplasticity and the horrific medical malpractice and abuse we experienced trying to get a diagnosis for what turned out to be a common visual impairment. I am now an international advocate for people who have cerebral/cortical visual impairment. And I talk a lot about verbal mediation as a compensatory strategy, which we'll talk about more later.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about neuroplasticity since you have some familiarity with that. Did you get that initially from your work in music?
Absolutely. Yeah, as a musician and as a music teacher, we were specifically instructed in the benefits of music and movement in early childhood, especially, but for everyone throughout their lives. And so, yeah, there's a lot to be gained from music and movement.
Right. And you talked about the book that you wrote, and Eyeless Mind. Tell us, like, let's get into that. And we've thrown around these words, cerebral, cortical, visual impairment. So we're going to kind of dive into that. Can you tell us just the high level, and then we'll get into the details, what cerebral, cortical, visual impairment is? And I think we could probably just call it CVI from here on out. Is that all right?
Yes, absolutely.
Tell us what that is.
So, CVI is a brain based vision impairment that's entirely different from ocular blindness. In ocular blindness, you have problems with the eye and the optic nerve. And typically sighted people tend to think, and this is a stereotype, but this is what they tend to think, that blindness means that everything is dark. And that even that is a stereotype. It's not true. The vast majority of people with ocular forms of blindness have some light perception. They may not see everything as black. They may see everything as pink or different shades. So that's ocular blindness. CVI is a brain-based vision impairment that can occur with ocular forms of vision impairment, or it can occur just by itself. In which case, it's actually common for people who have CVI to have normal acuity. And so they can go to the eye exam and pass all the acuity exams at the optometrist's office because they have normal acuity, but they will have different problems depending on where the brain damage is located. So about 40% of our brains are utilized in visual processing. And I was recently at a wonderful session with Dr. Arvind Chandna and also Professor Gordon Dutton. And the two of them were talking about CVI. And Dr. Chandna mentioned how as light comes through the eye and travels through the optic nerve past the lateral genicular nuclei, or the LGN, and travels to the back of the brain, there is absolutely no conscious perception of sight for about 1/10 of a second. That's how long it takes for the light to travel all the way to the back of the brain. And it is not until the signals actually reach the brain where we become conscious of vision. And so the whole concept of seeing with our eyes is really wrong. We see with our brains. There's no conscious perception of sight when the light lands in our eyes. Our eyes are literally just light collectors, and they send signals to the back of the brain, and the actual seeing happens in the brain. So people who have CVI
can interrupt you just right there, because that is so fascinating, and I just want that to like land with people for just a second. because you know this stuff so well. So like we could wind you up and you could just talk. But for the rest of us, is like astounding, really, to think of vision in this way. That vision isn't really with our eyes, that we see with our brains.
Well, and
And
I think it's really great you bring that up because there are human beings alive today, right now. For example, I'll talk about Daniel Kish, who lost both eyes to cancer in infancy and taught himself to echolocate. And I recently did a podcast with Brian Bushway, who is also ocularly blind, who studied with Daniel Kish. Daniel Kish teaches blind children to echolocate. And you don't even
and
need
that's like what bats do, right? That
right,
for like
like
the
bats
relay
or
people.
dolphins. Yeah. And they have put Brian in the, I mean, they put Daniel in the fMRI, which is a functional magnetic resonating. I can't talk today. I'm sorry. This is a terrible interview. It's a
No,
functional MRI. And it shows what the brain is actually doing as opposed to just showing a picture of what the brain looks like, right? And in the fMRI, Daniel Kish's visual cortex lights up when he hears echoes, but not when he hears ordinary sounds. So he literally sees with sound, just like a bat or a dolphin or a whale. And this is a teachable skill. He taught it to Brian Bushway, who I recently met with, who's a lovely person. And Brian also teaches it to others as well. You can teach echolocation to people with typical vision. So,
really? So
yeah,
like I could learn it.
you could learn it according to Brian. That's what he says. Yeah. So our brains see. You don't even need eyes to see. Humans can learn to echolocate. So there's a lot, all of vision, the processing happens in the brain. And we have, according to Professor Gordon Dutton, we have two pathways through the brain of visual processing. There's what's called the dorsal stream, which is the part that comes from the back of the brain up across the top of the head. And then there's the ventral stream, which comes from the back of the brain through the middle of the brain. And the dorsal stream is kind of the, if you have problems with your dorsal stream processing, you'll probably have problems with looking at a crowded scene, like finding Where's Waldo and the Where's Waldo picture books. You know, that's a very crowded jumble. And people who have dorsal stream processing problems can find those just very distressing to look at and impossible to do. And ventral stream issues have to do with the visual memory. And so that's where we have issues with facial recognition, object recognition, letter, number, words and symbol recognition, as well as biological forms, hands, feet, objects, fingers, and also places. And so when you take a minute to just touch your right ear, that's part of your head right behind and above your right ear, that's where your right fusiform gyrus is. And that's the area of the brain that's involved in processing facial recognition. So people who have brain damage to that area of the brain are very often, they have something called prosopagnosia, which is a difficulty or an impossibility of recognizing faces. It's also called face blindness. People who have face blindness also very often have topographical agnosia, which is an inability to recognize their surroundings, because the ability to process faces and recognize faces and the ability to recognize places are processed very close together in that area. And so if one area is damaged, it's very common for the other area to be damaged as well.
So this would be very disorienting to a person, especially if they didn't have language to
Oh,
express what it was that they were experiencing.
absolutely. Now, CVI can be acquired by anyone at any age, from brain damage, head injury, lack of oxygen, drowning, stroke. Those are all things that can cause CVI at any age. But we have just an enormous crisis right now. CVI was actually identified as the #1 cause of visual impairment in the developed world more than 10 years ago. And it still doesn't have a diagnostic code. It's actually more common than ocular blindness. And teachers of the visually impaired in general, more than half of the students in their caseloads have CVI. And on average, the average TVI receives little to no training in CVI whatsoever in their college preparatory programs. And I think there might be 2 programs that are requiring CVI training now, but the only one I know for sure right now in the US that requires teachers of the visually impaired to take coursework in CVI is UMass in Boston.
Mm-hmm. And this is because if you don't also have ocular impairment, it I mean, it really operates differently than ocular impairment. So most lay people and even doctors who should know better think of ocular impairment. You can tell that someone is blind. They can't see the way that you and I and the vast majority of people see, right? And
Exactly.
CBI, right.
And that's what happened to us, because I'll tell your listeners, in January of 2017, we discovered that my straight A artist, my water polo playing son, who was just excelling in every aspect of his life, he was almost completely blind and we had no idea. So CVI can be an entirely invisible disability. My son is almost entirely blind, and he passed every vision test every single year because he has normal acuity, and the areas of his brain that recognize words, letters, numbers, and simple shapes are not damaged. And so my son, although he can't recognize faces or places or objects or biological forms, he has the ability to read and to do math. And so my son passed every vision test every year because he can read the eye chart. And even though he can't.
Yeah, I'm going to interrupt again because, like, mind absolutely blown, right? Like, your average person probably can't even comprehend this without spending a little time thinking about this.
Sure. And that's where I would refer you back to the case of Dr. Oliver Sacks, who we've known about for many decades, the famous neuropsychologist. If you've ever seen the movie Awakenings, you know of the work of Dr. Oliver Sacks, or if you've ever read the book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. He was a prolific author. He wrote many books besides that one, but he did interviews on NPR. And I mean, he was just a very famous person, and he had CVI. He had both prosopagnosia with a face blindness, and he had topographical agnosia. And so he could not navigate because he had no way to create visual memories of anywhere he went. So that's right. It's a blindness of the environment. And you cannot create a mental map of something that you've never seen.
Right. And so, I mean, but this is, again, it's astounding for most people to think, wait a minute, you could sort of make your way through life, in the case of your son, for what, the first 15 years, without a loving, caring family, teachers, doctors, actually knowing that this was his condition.
Exactly. And if my son can be almost entirely blind and have absolutely nobody know, then anybody can be. And our optometric exams are just decades out of date. They are. Once I understood what some of the common symptoms of my son's common visual impairment were, it took me less than a minute in my kitchen to create some simple screening assessments to figure out whether he had those things or not. And I'm a music teacher. I did it in a minute in my kitchen. So my son could have been screened quickly and fairly easily as a toddler if any single one of his medical professionals had known how to do it.
So what kind of that you, as a music teacher, made up in the moment? What were these screening assessments? What did those look like?
So one of the things we realized that my son might have was something called simultaneous agnosia, which is actually a very common symptom of CVI. They used to think it was rare, but now they're thinking that it's totally not rare. Simultaneous agnosia for my son, what that means is, when typically sighted people think about tunnel vision, they think everything is dark except for this tunnel in the middle where everything is clear. And that is a form of ocular vision impairment that, a lot of people know about. Well, simultaneous agnosia is similar to tunnel vision, but it's not an ocular vision impairment. It's caused by the brain. And in my son's case, I can't speak for everyone who has CVI because everyone who has it is different and experiences their world differently. But for my son, the area that you think might be dark is actually full. He passes all of his visual field test screenings because he can see light and motion and vague blurry shapes, but it's like a fog of blurry colors. And it's basically useless information because it's just like walking through this thick pea soup fog of color and light and motion. Nothing makes any sense. And then in the very center of it, there's this teeny tiny hole, like about if you were looking through a McDonald's coffee straw. And through that tiny little hole in the center, my son has normal acuity. And through that little patch of acuity, my son has the ability to recognize words, letters, numbers, and simple shapes, and nothing else. And so my son's vision is very much like what I think a newborn's vision would be like, but a newborn who could read.
Let's take a quick break.
Hey everybody, this is Melissa with the Fully Mindful. It's the new year, and I bet you're feeling the need to unlock your full potential and embrace empowerment, or maybe something completely different. Well, I'm excited to offer a new program with one-on-one breathwork and coaching sessions. We'll embark on a truly transformative journey of self-discovery, combining conscious, connected breathwork and embodiment coaching, and more. So contact me, Melissa, at the Fully Mindful, for your transformative session today. Mm-hmm. And what's so fascinating about that is your son, I'm assuming this was just normal for him. I mean, this is his reality. And so unless somebody was screening for it specifically or looking for this specifically, he maybe at least could get by in life without not only anyone knowing, but maybe even just thinking that that was just how everybody saw it.
Well, I'm really glad you brought that up, because all children who are born with CVI assume that their vision is typical. They assume that everybody sees what they see because they have absolutely nothing to compare their vision to. And so they literally don't know that their vision is different. And yes, because my son was extremely academically able and had he was just scoring in the 99th percentile in both math and English on all standardized testing without any assistance whatsoever from us for his whole life. And he was social, and he made friends, and he was athletic, and my blind son was getting A's in gym every quarter when I'm very much a C student. So I was like, where'd you get that from? It's not for me, And so, yeah, he literally went through the grade promotion process without triggering any alarms. And we actually fought the grade promotion for social reasons. My son finished the 4th grade math book first quarter of 3rd grade, and his gifted teacher came flying out of the building in December on a 20-degree day with no coat on to tell me that he'd finished the 4th grade math book and he needed to move up a grade. And I didn't even know he'd even been advanced in the math book. He wasn't talking to me about what was going on. And so this was a shock. So we fought it because we didn't want to separate my son from his friends. He had a really nice cohort of friends, and we didn't know any of the kids in the grade above. And so we asked for other options, and grade promotion turned out to be by far the least bad of the 3 options we were given. And so we did it gradually over 6 months, and it turned out to be a very successful thing for my son because there was no other option. But if you know anything about the grade promotion process, you know that they examine every part of a child before they can approve it. They look at their academic, their social, their physical, their emotional and psychological. They look at everything before they can go through that. And my son, who is almost completely blind, went through all of that assessment without triggering any alarms whatsoever from anybody.
Right. But this is important information for later, right? I mean, you get some important information from some of these early assessments, if I remember correctly.
Well, that was the thing. The only things that we had that there might be something wrong with my son was what appeared to be mild separation anxiety in early childhood. So my son cried at drop-off every day for 2 years of preschool, which was completely mysterious because he was making eye contact. We have photos of my blind son who can't recognize his face or anybody else's, making regular, consistent eye contact from his earliest days. Wow. It's mind-blowing. And the thing is, we know, according to Professor Gordon Dutton, my son, we know, has always responded to facial expressions. He's always been extremely sensitive to facial expressions. And so he actually has something called affective blindsight, which means that my son can recognize the facial expressions, even though he can't actually recognize the faces themselves. And that's a really powerful motivator for a blind child to be looking at a face, even if he can't recognize the face. He can still be looking for the facial expression. And so I think that's why he was always appearing to make eye contact. And we just have photo after photo of him with, strangers, like neighbors and family members and us, and it wasn't a one-off thing, so.
Well, and in fact, wasn't it the photos in part kind of what helped you discover that your son had CVI?
It actually was. Thank you. Yes. Yeah, he was 15 years old and was excelling in school, was on the diving team and the water polo team. And we just happened to be going through old photos on my computer. And I am that mom who literally bought $1,500 worth of creative memories, scrapbooking supplies, and made my son this enormous, fabulous baby book, and then never did anything again with it.
Oh, I'm the same. I have on my, one of my old computers, a very organized, folder system with all of the first year of photos.
Yeah.
And then promptly forgot all about that. So
Yeah.
totally understand.
I made it through one scrapbook. Exactly. And then we did nothing with it for years. And here it is 15 years later. And we haven't really gone back to look at these pictures, honestly. So we were sitting on the sofa together with the computer, and I was narrating to my son who was in the pictures, because there was a lot of pictures of people in the baby photos that he wouldn't remember or wouldn't recognize, because we have family all over the place, Canada and far. So I was saying, oh, look, there you are with your cousins from Canada, that you haven't seen for 7 years. And oh, look, there you are with the neighbors from the other house we lived in when you were a baby that you wouldn't remember. And we were doing this for about half an hour. And we kind of migrated out of the baby toddler age into the preschool age. So my son had been looking at pictures of his own face now for half an hour, and a really cute picture of him popped up on the screen. And I said, oh, look, who's that? And it was just crickets. And finally, he just said, how would I know? And I just was astonished, because in 2017, I had never heard of CVI. I had never heard of prosopagnosia. I didn't know that it was possible for a human being to be face blind. And my son is an accomplished artist who draws and paints with photographic realism when he wants to, including faces. And so I was just astonished. I just looked at him and I'm like, what do you mean you don't know? Like, that's you. And he was just like, okay, if you say so. So I started quizzing him on people in the other pictures, myself, my husband, 15 years younger or whatever, with less gray hair and thinner, obviously us, and he was guessing. My honor student was guessing, and so then I was like, this is not typical. This is not okay. Mm-hmm. I wasn't scared so much as just fascinated and like a little freaked out. I mean, like the hairs on my neck stood up, but I wasn't afraid for him. I just thought, this is very strange. And so when he went to bed, of course, I went right to work with researching, and it took me quite some time, because back in 2017, there was very little information to find about this. And it took me quite some time, several hours, before I got the magic combination of words about facial recognition that's got me out of like the facial recognition software rabbit hole into like human problems with facial recognition. Mm-hmm. And then I found prosopagnosia, and I was like, it's a real thing.
So what did you do when you finally get all this information? What do you do?
2:00 in the morning. So I woke up my husband, who did not appreciate it. I woke him up and I was like, I figured it out. He has a real problem. This is a real thing, and my husband was like, okay, whatever. And he went back to bed. But then the very next day, that's when we figured out that my son had taught himself to navigate our own home by counting his steps and turns, and had been navigating our home, our small neighborhood, and his extremely architecturally complex schools by counting his steps and turns. And he'd been doing it this way since he was a toddler, and we had no idea. And he had no idea that anybody did it differently. He thought everybody.
You're like talking to him, and it's like you're learning that your son is doing all of this stuff, and you're both sort of learning in that moment, like, oh my God.
Yeah. Then it was terrifying. Yeah. because then I knew that his life was in danger, that he was always planning to go off to college. He was looking forward to starting driver's ed. My blind son, he can never safely drive. He has so little vision. And we were literally just about to enroll him in driver's ed, and this was a huge blow. Can you imagine? I had to tell my son he was blind on our kitchen floor. He didn't even know he was blind. I didn't know he was blind.
How did that, as a parent, as parents, how did both you and your husband feel when you figured this out? And this is devastating, I'm sure.
Oh my gosh. Well, first of all, because of my history with abuse and abandonment, right? I understand the terror of being lost. It is terrifying to be blind and have nobody around you know that and be able to give you help that you need. It is terrifying to be lost in your own home, in your own neighborhood, in your own school. And children, I happen to know several adults who have CBI who also didn't get diagnosed for years, most of them into adulthood. One was 26, is legally blind and didn't get diagnosed till they were 26. And these are all people, they suffer just tremendous trauma from this. It is terrifying. It is absolutely, I give it the equivalent of torture to put a blind child out into the world and not give them the simple services that they need. And in my son's case, I knew right then he needed orientation and mobility training with the white cane so that he could get through and learn how to go off to college safely and navigate in the wider world safely without getting hit by a bus or a truck. And I realized how much our small neighborhood on a very quiet street, how much we had missed because just the fate of the fact that we lived on an extremely quiet street in a very small and quiet neighborhood. We happened to, because of where we're located, we have to drive to practically everything. There's almost nothing that you could get to from our house by walking. There's a Starbucks and a McDonald's, right? Yeah.
Well, and I bet you suddenly, all those moments start flooding back, the drop-offs for preschool where your son was just crying uncontrollably, but yet was very socially adept for his age. And
his best friends were there in his preschool. He loved his friends. He loved his teacher. He loved the activities at preschool. So it made absolutely no sense because he was making eye contact. He was doing beautifully in every respect. And I remember asking his doctor, asking his teachers, why is he crying at drop off? What is this about? It makes no sense. And they just said, oh, some kids just do that. And we worry about the ones who can't settle down. Well, my son always settled down right away and he appeared to be fine, but he wasn't fine. He didn't outgrow that anxiety. What he learned is that telling adults that you're scared doesn't help. And so he's just stopped telling us that he was afraid. He didn't outgrow it. He didn't outgrow his blindness. He didn't magically become not blind. He just stopped communicating with us about his terror. And he figured out.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Humans are highly adaptable. And so what he was doing was adapting.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And it's just heartbreaking. And that's a big reason why I do this work, because I know that if my son can appear to be 100% typically sighted and academically and socially and physically successful in every way, then and still be almost entirely blind, then that means that anybody can be walking around and passing their vision tests because they can read and still, just like Dr. Oliver Sacks and just like my son, have no ability to form a mental map of the world because they cannot see their surroundings. And I know people have a hard time processing this, but you just have to imagine walking into a room and you cannot see anything in the room. You can't see the bed. You can't see the lamp. You can't see the bedside table. You can't see any of those things or where they are in relationship to each other. And you can't see where the bed is in relationship to the door to the bathroom. You can't see those things. And so the way human beings make mental maps of the world is they can see where something is and form a memory of it, and they can see in relationship where it is to something else. So in my mind, I can picture where my sofa in my family room is in relationship to where the dining room table is. I can picture it. People who have topographic agnosia cannot do that.
Right.
They
I mean,
can't.
that's why typically sighted people, like myself, or maybe some listeners out there, we get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom. I'm a woman of a certain age, so this happens on a regular basis for me. And I don't have to turn the light on because I have a memory, a mind map, if you will, of what my bedroom and the route to the restroom is. I know exactly where everything is. I'm oriented to that, even though I technically am not seeing anything because it's very dark. And that's what you're talking about, right? We have this map in our minds because we've seen it.
Because we've seen it, and we can remember what it looks like, and we can remember where one thing is in relationship to where another thing is. So if you have never seen where one thing is in relationship to another thing, you can't have a map of where the two things are.
Right. It's as if, in my example, instead of waking up in my bedroom, somebody suddenly transported me to some other location that I have never been, and it's pitch black and I have to get somewhere.
Very disorienting. Very disorienting. And my son happened to figure out through years of practice how many steps and turns there were from his bed to the bathroom, from his bed to the dresser. And he memorized it. And he didn't just do this for a house. He did it to his friends' houses in the neighborhood. He memorized his way to the Starbucks. Several blocks away.
The important thing, Starbucks.
Right. My son took the training wheels off his bike when he was 4. So he was riding around on his bike to the Starbucks, right? Like he knew how many turns there were. He knew the turns, even though he couldn't picture it in his mind. He could count the turns. Yeah.
Wow. So, were you still teaching at that point when you made this discovery with your son?
I was teaching Music Garden, which is a wonderful Montessori-based early childhood music and movement program. And I was doing it out of my home. I had about 7 classes of baby, toddler, and preschool classes in my home.
Yeah, and then your world sort of gets thrown a little upside down, right? Because you don't have the experience of, I guess we'll just take my son to the doctor and get this figured out and get him the help he needs. That's not what happens.
Well, actually, that's exactly what I thought would happen. I was very naive, right? So I had done the research and I had the correct medical terminology to describe my son's symptoms from that very first night when we discovered he was face blind. And the next day when we discovered he had topographic agnosia and was navigating by counting his steps and turns, that very next day after that, I made a doctor's appointment with the neuropsychologist who had done a full neuropsych evaluation on my son just about a month before for a totally unrelated concussion. And this doctor just looked at us like we were aliens and said, I can't help you and I don't know anyone who can. Good luck with that. And we saw optometrists, neuro-optometrists, ophthalmologists, neuro-ophthalmologists, neurologists, neuropsychologists. We just traveled across the country looking for anyone who could diagnose my son and prescribe a couple of weeks of orientation and mobility training so that my son could learn how to navigate independently in unfamiliar locations.
And just stop right there. If it isn't crazy enough that you're having to travel all over the place to get a diagnosis, it's not like it's not like you or your son or your husband were looking for, I don't know, some crazy treatment. And I go back to the Munchausen, right? Where kind of how that might manifest as somebody, like you said, subjecting their child to, something horrific or repeated, or like what you experienced, incredible neglect and abandonment. You're not looking for that. And the only reason I even bring that up is because you experience being accused of that.
Oh, they never came out and said it outright, but boy, they sure did imply it. Yeah, we were
definitely. And that's what I mean. It's, it's gotta, given your experience as a, as a survivor of that,
Oh, it was incredibly insulting. And it just fueled my desire to get to the truth even more, because I'm like, there's no way you are labeling me with this, because I didn't tell this to your readers earlier, but I made the very painful and careful decision to end my relationship with my mom when I was pregnant with my son for safety reasons. And there's a lot more to the story than just the abandonment. There's very, very severe safety issues. And so for all those reasons, my husband and I went to a very good therapist, and for a year we talked about like, how, could we in any possible way set safety parameters around my son to keep him safe from my mom in her presence. And the answer just came down to no. There was no safe way to do it. And so it was an extremely painful decision, but I learned so much. I mean, I learned about family systems theory, and I learned about codependency and all these things, so I made a conscious decision to do everything in my power to not be like my mom. And then here I am 15 years later, and they're very obviously implying that I am, right? And if we weren't asking for like illegal drugs or narcotics or like unneeded surgery, or, they treated us like really like we wanted to give them, I don't know, just
electroshock therapy or something. Yeah.
Right. Like we're asking for something completely crazy. And I'm like, no, he's really smart. And he's going to learn this in a couple of weeks, and that's all he needs. And then we'll be done.
A diagnosis in a couple of weeks.
Yeah. And that's it. Right. And the hardest, I think the thing that was worse is we had actual hard evidence of what we were saying about my son's vision in the form of 2 separate neuropsych evaluations done years apart. There was one done when he was a 3rd grader, and they were telling us he needed to skip a grade. And then we had a separate one done when he got a concussion his sophomore year, which was, a few months before we figured out he had CVI. And in the first one, when he was a 3rd grader, my son, who was scoring in the 99th percentile in both math and English on all standardized testing without any assistance whatsoever, scored at the very top in the verbal portion of the IQ test, but then in visual spatial was seriously lower at, I think it was above average. Like, I think I can't remember the number, but it was above average. So there was this big gap between his scores on the IQ test, verbal and visual spatial, and a big gap between his actual achievement in math. So I was like, if he's got lower, still above average, but comparatively lower visual spatial scores, shouldn't he be bad at math? Here's my kid who just finished the 4th grade math book without any help. Right. And when the teacher was like, well, what I can't figure out is how he knew how to multiply and divide fractions. And I had no idea. And my husband
and me neither, because I definitely don't know how to multiply.
I don't even remember. Right. I'm a music teacher. I don't use any of that. Right. And my husband was at the meeting, and he thinks, and he's like, oh, he asked about that once last year. So I showed him. Right. So my son saw it once a year ago and remembered a year later and then applied it. Right. And that's how he is with math. He requires almost no instruction to learn a new skill. Right. He just sees it and he does it. Yeah. So here I am with this report going, how do you explain? I was actually bringing my son's standardized test scores into the doctor's appointments going, look at the difference between the scores. How do you explain the math scores when you have this lower visual spatial thing, right? Like there's a deficit in his visual spatial processing. It's more than 20 points. By the time he was in high school, after he had a concussion, he was in borderline impaired in visual spatial on the neuropsych evaluation. Still scored a perfect 150 on the verbal part, perfect 150 on the verbal part, and was borderline impaired in visual spatial. And the doctor's telling me he's fine and there's nothing wrong with him.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I can see with my own eyes that that's not right.
So at some point, you're traveling all over the place, probably spending all kinds of money. I don't know what kind of insurance you have and whether or not it was paying for any of this, but I'm assuming you're incurring some costs on your own.
$150,000 in medical bills to get a diagnosis for the most common form of visual impairment in the developed world.
Wow.
And I was labeled a Munchausen mom. and we were repeatedly verbally and emotionally abused. And I've got the
And I
light
think,
shining on me in a funny way.
oh, sure. I think at one point, I think you were telling me that like a doctor yelled at you, like literally yelled at you.
Oh, I was physically threatened by a neuro-ophthalmologist that we had never even met. And we were made to wait. Our appointment was at 3 or 3:30 in the afternoon. And we sat in the waiting room until absolutely everyone had left. And it was like 5:30 or 6 o'clock at night. And we were shown into the exam room and we waited longer, probably until most of the staff left. And then he burst into the waiting room and put his fist in my face and screamed at me in front of my son, saying, "Tell me how it's possible he can recognize words and letters and not faces. It's all the same channels." And he was huge.
Wow.
And I mean, I taught middle school. I'm 5'11" and a half feet tall. I have broken up fights.
Oh, my daughter's in middle school, so I know what you did.
I'm not easily intimidated, right? And this actually was terrifying. I think, first of all, because we were so emotionally raw and vulnerable already. This was doctor's appointment 1012 or whatever,
Right.
and we're just so desperate to get some help. And this happens. And it was just, he yelled through the entire appointment. He actually waved his right hand at me while he was typing on the computer with his left. I'm like, that takes skill.
And your minor son is sitting there.
Right in front of my 15-year-old kid. It was just awful.
Yeah, it is awful. And I mean, even I mean, I'm going to have a doctor on the show in a couple of weeks, and she's amazing, and she does integrative medicine, and I think that's a whole different field, and I would hope that is not what you would have experienced, certainly not with someone like her, but with with other sorts of doctors, it's terrifying also. That you also have to rely on these very people who are treating you this way.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was just devastating. There's no words to describe it. And the sad thing is, our experiences actually are not uncommon.
Yeah.
People,
that's what you've come to learn, right? Is in
right?
doing this work, is you talk to people on a regular basis whose experience is very much like yours.
Oh, absolutely. People who have CVI are routinely misdiagnosed with autism, intellectual disabilities, and emotional and behavioral disorders because they'll just label them as anything except what they are, which is blind or visually impaired.
Right.
And, when you have children who literally cannot see the work to do it, they get labeled as defiant because they can't do the work that they literally cannot see.
Right. And may not even have the language like we were talking about in order to explain what is happening for them, because
they don't know.
They don't know. It's always what they just think, this is the way everybody is. So then they internalize that.
They do.
As there is something wrong or bad with them, instead of, oh, no, there's just this, visual deficit. I have this condition that I actually can get help with.
Right. So they're traumatized, the ones who need orientation and mobility and don't get that, they're traumatized from that terror. And then they're traumatized from the accusations of being defiant, of being obstinate, refusing to do work that they can't see. Right. I mean, they do internalize that. And all of the adults and teens that I know, and I know several, have very traumatic educational stories, in addition to the medical trauma that they've gone through.
I am so sure. And I wonder how you and your family were taking care of yourselves and your emotional health during this experience.
Well, there wasn't a lot of opportunity for that. We just tried to get through it, So I'm actually really, really glad, because I feel like I am finally now. It is 2017 in January when we figured it out. And now it's 2022 in June. I don't know how many years that is. I am finally in a better place after having, published a paper about this for the Association for the Education and Rehabilitation of the Blind and Visually Impaired, and then publishing our book and participating in 3 different research. This will be our 3rd research study coming up in August. We'll be going back to Boston to participate with the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity at the Shepard's Eye Research Institute, which is directed by Dr. Lotfi Marabet. We'll be going back in August for the 2nd round for that. And so I feel like I am finally starting to feel like I am recovering from what we went through. And it's been years. And honestly, I don't know if my son will ever recover from the trauma that he lived. He lived 15 years of trauma, really.
Right.
And then having the trauma of the diagnosis and all of that craziness on top of that.
On top of it, right. Were you able to keep your job through all this, or did you have to give that up in order to do this?
I had to give it up.
Yeah.
So I was teaching a lot of afternoon classes. Many of my moms worked and would come in the afternoons often with their husbands, and it was absolutely lovely. And we did manage in April of 2017, I managed to secure occupational therapy for navigation for my son, Sebastian, at a very major center for rehabilitation in Chicago. And we got approved for about 4 months of occupational therapy to help my son learn how to navigate using technology. And we were going 3 days a week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesdays after school. And so I had to put aside all of my classes because that was when I was teaching, and the other few days when I was still available, it didn't work for all of the other families. And it was just too much with all of the additional medical doctor's appointments that were going on, because my son actually has another condition too. So that wasn't enough.
Yeah.
So I actually, took apart my business and referred all my clients to other teachers, and I didn't have a choice.
Well, yeah. And I mean, and so you do eventually get a diagnosis for your son. Tell us a little bit more about that. Like, how did that finally happen?
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful question. And I'm so glad you asked it. So the only reason we got help getting a diagnosis was because of Lucas Frank at the Seeing Eye Guide Dog Organization. And Lucas is an internationally known guide dog trainer. He travels across the world helping places set up guide dog centers for the blind.
Yeah.
And just a day or two after we figured out that Sebastian was navigating by counting his steps and turns, I reached out to the Seeing Eye, and I knew nothing about blindness and I knew nothing about guide dogs, but all I could think, I was just terrified for my son, thinking of him being lost and alone in this world and not able to navigate. And so I just reached out and called, and Pauline Surf Alexander answered the phone, and she's a lovely person. And she talked to me calmly about like what my son's symptoms were and how we figured it out. And she asked me, is he bumping into things? And I said, well, no, he's never bumped into anything. And she said, well, a guide dog's function is really to prevent a blind person from bumping into things. They don't actually navigate. They don't take the blind person to the store, right? They just keep them from bumping into the fire hydrant on the way to the store, right? And so, I mean, I was so desperate and scared for my son. I was like, oh, that makes sense. And if I hadn't been so upset, I probably would have realized that, but I was so upset, And so I thought that would be the end of it. I just never thought I'd hear another thing from that organization. And a couple of days later, Lucas Frank called, and he was very interested. And he spent quite a long time on the phone asking me how we figured out what was going on and what the symptoms were, and, about Sebastian. And he took me completely seriously, was very kind on the phone. And then he talked to Sebastian for quite some time and got back on the phone with me afterwards and gave me some contacts at the Chicago Lighthouse for the Blind. Tom Persky was one name he gave me, and Tom was fabulous. We went out there and he talked with us about different technologies and things like that for navigation. The navigation team, the technology team was just wonderful. So anyway, he was really helpful, and I was so grateful. And again, I thought I'd never hear from him again. Just didn't expect anything else. And a few months went by, and we're still trying to get a diagnosis, and things are getting worse and worse and worse. And it's Lucas Frank who bails me out again. He reaches out and he said, how's it going? And I'm like, it's terrible. And he knew what was going on. And he actually connected me with Jim Daramayak, who is the head of rehabilitation at the Johns Hopkins Eye Clinic. And Jim actually donated a $150 course on CVI to me so that I could be a better advocate for my son. This was Memorial Day weekend of 2017, and I dove into it on Saturday, and I finished it on Monday and got an A. It was like, I don't know, some 6-hour course. I don't know. You know, and I just like tearing it apart. And so when I was done here, I'm sending an email on Tuesday morning to Mr. Daramaic with this long, long list of everything that's wrong with my son's vision. Right. And going, now what do I do? And so even with Jim's help, then we still couldn't get a doctor to take us seriously, even with him. And so after that last doctor's appointment, I was like, okay, I'm done. I'm just going to find the guy who taught the course. And that turned out to be Professor Gordon Dutton, who's in Scotland. And he was phenomenal. I sent an email, and a day or two later, I got a beautiful response. And we Skyped a few times. He's like, okay, well, we need to set up a research study with Dr. Sylvie Chakran in Paris. And so I had to take my son to Paris for a week-long research study with Dr. Sylvie Chakran, who is the director of the Unit of Vision and Cognition at La Fondation Rothschild in Paris. She is amazing and so kind, and it was incredible. And the reason that research study was so important is because part of the reason we had such a difficult time getting a diagnosis for my son's CVI is because my son has a normal appearing MRI. An MRI only measures the structure of the brain. It does not show the function. And so approximately 10% of people who have cerebral palsy also have normal appearing MRIs, and they still have cerebral palsy. And the numbers are believed to be about the same for CVI. So when we went to Paris, Dr. Chakran arranged for my son to have probably a $10,000 SPECT scan, which we were charged a couple $100 for. And the SPECT scan is a nuclear medicine test that measures blood flow to the brain. Any areas of the brain that are not receiving any blood flow are dead tissue. And so there we were able to see that although my son has a normal MRI, my son has significant brain damage where there's significant areas of his brain that are not receiving any blood flow. And so we finally had proof of the brain damage. And finally, we were able to get someone to pay attention to us here in the US. And that was wonderful. So we came back home, and I connected with, it was Dr. Mindy Ely at ISU. And she's amazing. She's in low vision. She connected me with several different people, but especially she connected me with Dr. Barry Cran, who's the head of optometrics at the New England Eye Low Vision Clinic at the Perkins School for the Blind. And she also connected me with Dr. Lotfi Marabet, who is the director of the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity at the Schepens Eye Research Institute. And the two of them, they were phenomenal. And like I said, we are still continuing to work with Dr. Marabet on research. Dr. Marabet and Dr. Barry Cran co-wrote a paper on my son's use of verbal mediation to process his vision. And it was published this past fall in Neurobiologia. And his fMRI scans are included in that paper.
I'm looking at just a printout of the, sort of high level of that paper, and we'll link it in the show notes for people who want to learn more about it. But yeah, I mean, it's, for the listeners out there, I mean, obviously you can tell how credible Stephanie is, but when you have a research paper behind what is you've experienced, now you really have extra credibility. And those two doctors are on there. There are a couple other doctors. And, this paper is really pretty extraordinary because not only does it validate your son's CVI, but it also discusses the sort of unique way in which he has navigated the world. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the reasons my son was able to pass as 100% typically sighted all his life is because my son Sebastian is the only person in the world known to process his vision verbally, which means that he literally sees with words just like a bat sees with sound. So like Daniel Kish, who taught himself to echolocate in infancy, my son has unique visual processing. Back before I had cataract surgery last year, I used to always wear glasses. And so when I say that my son sees with words, he can't recognize people. He can't recognize faces by the way they look. And so he has to recognize people and objects and things by the way that we describe them. And so My description that he came up with was tall blonde glasses, because I'm tall, I have blonde hair, and I have glasses. If you put me in a room full of tall blonde women wearing glasses, my son wouldn't really necessarily be able to pick me out.
Mhm.
I would just be one of many. But his descriptors for me are tall blonde glasses. And when my son thinks those words to himself, he literally gets a momentary flash of what I look like. It's just a flash of understanding. There's no retention in visual memory. He can't picture my face the way that I can picture, his face or the Mona Lisa. He just gets this glimpse. And so my son has the ability to do this for everything and everyone he encounters in daily life. He has memorized how everything and everyone around him, what their verbal characteristics are, how we would describe them to someone else. And when he thinks those words, he gets this little quick flash of understanding of what it looks like. And that's how he has passed for typically sighted, because my son basically lives in a world, he says it's like being in an alien universe where nothing ever looks familiar. That's what his visual world is like, except for words, letters, numbers, simple shapes. Those things he can see just like we do. But everything else is just this blur, this useless, foggy blur of uselessness, right? It's just like being out in a colorful fog in the middle of an ocean, and like street signs float past every once in a while, and that's the only thing you ever see. So it's just this whole different visual experience for him. And of course, we figured this out at home. We had the help of having the 2 different neuropsych evaluations to realize that my son was verbally compensating. And we just figured it out through having conversations. Well, what do you see? What things can you picture? How, and we figured it out, and I was right. So when we reached out,
yeah,
yeah,
100% right. And so this research paper, I mean, they talk about that, like tell us a little bit about like how they figured out that he could see with words.
well, I figured it out. Sebastian and I
Well,
figured
yes,
it
you
out.
did, and then this is validated, right?
Yes.
And
then
you discovered, yes.
and on the phone with Dr. Merritt, he's like, can he control it? And I'm like, yes, he can. Actually, Sebastian was sitting there right there, and I was like, can you control it? And Sebastian thought for a minute, and then he was like, yes, I can. And I said, yes, I can, into the phone. And that's how that went. Yeah. Yeah.
And they could actually see this on the imaging that they did, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the fMRI image shows how the brain is actually functioning. So just like with Daniel Kish, whose visual cortex lights up when he hears echoes, but not when he hears ordinary sounds, right? My son's visual cortex completely lights up when he's thinking word descriptors, but not when he's not. So you can see it in the paper. You can see the fMRI scans there. So my son is actually the only person in the world who is known to be able to choose to see or not see with his eyes wide open. Because when he's not thinking verbal descriptors of what things, the way we describe things, how things look like, he actually has no conscious perception of sight at all. And actually, Sebastian spends a great deal of his waking time completely blind, because if he's listening to a lecture, if he is listening to music, if he's sitting around the house listening to a conversation, his vision is off. It's just, he's focused on what he's hearing, and he's not thinking about what things look like. He's just listening. And there's no way you can tell, because there's no on-off switch in the middle of his forehead that says, oh, it's off now, right?
I just find this so fascinating, and I'm sure you do too, because it's your son, and also this work that you've done, and you have this profound appreciation for all of this work. And it's just fascinating to me from a human perspective. And we talked about this earlier about, the ability to adapt. And you said he was verbally compensating for the other deficits that he had. And it's so amazing to me that we as humans can do this, right? That despite trauma, despite, all of these things that are happening to us and these deficits, we're this amazing species where, we kind of figure it out, especially in a supportive family. I mean, he had this, beautiful supportive family, strong family, this mom who's just, a never ending advocate, and and that's huge, right? I'm sure it didn't just happen when he was 15. You'd been that way from, age 0 on. And so, having those supports and having, and I think you also talk about he was surrounded by music because of the fact that you are a music teacher,
Mhm.
and you had all these things that created this perfect world for him to be able to adapt in a way that, many others maybe wouldn't be able to adapt. But it's still just amazing. It's like where there's no dirt in the sidewalk and a flower grows, right? It's just
Right.
like
Yeah.
life figures it out. I mean, not always, right? And there's some tragedies out there, but
Mhm.
your son happens to be, because of all the things that you created in his world and that he created in his world.
Yeah. I really appreciate you saying that because I feel like I provided experiences and opportunities and he did the rest.
Yeah.
So for the listeners out there, my son quite literally taught himself to see with art.
Mm-hmm.
He was born an artist. He has been passionate and just loved every minute of it from the time he was a very tiny toddler.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's just spent hours in the bathtub with finger paints as a small child. It was unreal. And, I would have the paper palette out for him to paint with the brushes, and he would do one picture for me, and then he'd start painting his skin, and a lot of moms would have been like, okay, you're done now.
Yeah.
And I didn't have any other kids. So I was like, oh, okay, now you're going in the bathtub, because it's going on the skin. So, and that's what he did. And I honestly think there's something about the dual sensory nature of feeling the paint and seeing it at the same time that was really therapeutic for my son. I'm not an art therapist. I don't know what that is, but I just think, especially for a child with CVI who cannot see their own limbs, but to see the color, the movement of the color and feel it simultaneously at the same time, I think this was extremely therapeutic for my son. And he spent a lot of time doing it.
Yeah.
And he literally memorized all the verbal characteristics of his toys and the things that he saw around him by drawing and painting and sculpting them, starting with the Teletubbies as a tiny toddler. We had so many coloring pages of Tinky Winky and Dipsy and Lala and Poe. And think about the simple characteristics for a toddler, right? It's purple. Right. It's got a round ball for a head. It's got a round ball for a tummy. It's got a thing sticking out for an arm and another thing on the other side. It's very, very simple, easy characteristics, verbal characteristics for a small child to memorize. And he literally taught himself the verbal characteristics of just everything through practice, through painting and drawing. And he spent hours every day at this, every day, all his childhood. And I just provided the materials. Right. We just have to buy markers and more markers, it's just amazing.
Well, and he's continued to be an artist, right? I mean, yes, he got this diagnosis and, went through all that he went through in order to get the diagnosis and the orientation training and all of that. And he has, despite all of the trauma, he's really flourished, right?
He really has. We're so incredibly lucky. We are just so grateful for the fact that he's doing as well as he is. And we're so lucky, honestly. So Sebastian, although he has almost no visual memory whatsoever, and the only things he can see the way that typically sighted people do are words, letters, numbers, simple shapes. He actually, he got a 5 on the AP Art History exam in high school.
Wow.
Yeah, he did it blind, not able to recognize faces or places or people, but he has a way he can recognize the brush stroke and the styles and the colors. I don't know how he does it. Honestly, I don't know, but he got a 5 and he received the Presidential Award and Scholarship to the School of the Art Institute. And I think it was in 2020. What year did the pandemic come down that spring? Was that 2020?
Yeah, 2020.
Yeah, so it was 20. He went there in 2019, that fall. And he had a fabulous time there. He absolutely loved it. But he made a connection with a science professor, actually, that they just clicked. And so he took a job that summer after the pandemic came and worked as a research assistant. And he actually co-authored a paper related to virology related to the pandemic. And so he has taken a real change in his career path, and he's looking at a STEM career now, more science. Yeah, but he'll always be a creator. Yeah, he He
Well,
actually
I mean,
writes.
science and art are really not that far apart. I
Oh, I
mean,
know. I think it
yeah,
is an art, right? But
yeah.
he's actually writing now. He is a paid content creator for the Lair magazine. It's an online Dungeons and Dragons magazine, and
Oh,
they
cool.
actually commission him to create content for this magazine, like adventures for people to play. So yeah, he's just was commissioned to write another one recently. So he'll have a new one coming out.
Well, maybe he'll end up helping with season 5 of Stranger Things, since I'm sure that's going to come out at some point. They left it hanging, so I'm waiting.
Yeah.
And then meanwhile, I mean, you've continued to do your work. You wrote your book,
Mhm.
um, and which I'll also connect in the show notes because I think people are going to want to read it.
Thank you so much.
And you know, you've continued to be involved in advocacy because I think, as you mentioned, there are many, 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 many people who are undiagnosed
Mm.
CVI and who either need advocacy with respect to figuring that out, or have had the unfortunate experiences or similar experiences that you and your family had with sort of being deemed crazy, or which is just nuts because, like you said, it is the most common form of impairment, right? For
It is.
visual impairment.
It is the most common form of visual impairment in the developed world, and they've known that for more than 10 years. So yeah, I am busy. I recently published a very long blog article for the Perkins School for the Blind, Paths to Literacy. So if you're up for 15 pages of my opinions, I'd be happy to put that in the link as well. I have a
What do you
lot of
mean you
opinions.
have opinions about this?
I have a few. Yes, I have a few, and I'm not shy about sharing them whatsoever. Yeah, so I do a lot with advocacy. I donate, I don't know, anywhere between 10 and 20 hours of my week every week with CVI families who often they just need a shoulder to cry on, honestly. So, and I love just connecting with families and helping them to find the right connections and the right services, and helping them sometimes to understand maybe what their child's vision is like and what questions they should ask their child. And everybody's child is different, so every situation is different. But it's, yeah, I found some really wonderful friends through the CVI community, and I'm so incredibly blessed. And so, yeah, I I would never want any family to go through what we went through. And at the same time, I'm really glad that we got to where we are. It's so
Yeah.
much better knowing than not knowing.
Yeah, and I mean, you sort of, this podcast, we often talk about, how people have found their purpose. And, I know you didn't set out to be an expert in CVI and discover a new medical condition and, all of that. It landed for you, but you took it and you ran with it. And now you're giving back to to this community, and probably, I guess I would argue, other communities, because what people experience in terms of not getting a medical diagnosis or having people understand what they're going through is pretty common. And so, for other people who might not have CVI or have a family member who have CVI, if you're having trouble getting a diagnosis, and or being understood, do you have some recommendations for those folks about, like, now looking back over the last 5 years, what is sort of your, I don't want to call them tips, but like, how, when you look back, what was the most effective for you in terms of making sure you and your family got what you needed?
There were two things. First, once I realized that the wall of resistance we were meeting, which happened pretty immediately, at the first doctor's appointment, but it took me a couple of bad doctor's appointments before it really clicked that we were really going to have a hard time with this.
Mm-hmm.
But once I realized, that's when I started documenting. And so if you're a parent and you have some type of something going on with your child, and you're not, there's something wrong, but you're not getting that response from your medical community, you need to document what's going on. And so for me, that meant just taking notes after every doctor's appointment. What crazy things did they tell me? What things did I say? And it didn't have to be long. It was just, this is what I said. This was the response, right? This is what we saw. And I documented all the little details of how we figured out that Sebastian was seeing with words. I didn't just document the fact that we had bad doctor's appointments. I was like, today we figured out this. And I wrote down what it was we saw and what we talked about and how we figured it out. And I have 36 single-space type pages of documentation of what it took to get a diagnosis for a common visual impairment that we've known about since World War I, right? It took that much effort to get a diagnosis for something that we've studied for 100 years. And so documentation is very, very important. And the second thing is, if you've got something and it feels like the doctors don't know anything about what you're talking about, what I found was that when I was talking to people outside the medical profession, I was taken completely seriously. I was taken completely seriously by Lucas Frank at the Seeing Eye. I was taken completely seriously by Tom Persky at the Lighthouse for the Blind. I was taken completely seriously by our speech pathologist, Shar Lorson, right? I'm like, and it was the weirdest thing because it was like, I go to these people and be treated like a perfectly sane, normal mom. And then I go to a doctor's appointment and it was like the whole world flipped upside down. And, here I am, this crazy person that no one should listen to. And so there was this very strange dichotomy. And so if you are experiencing that, you need to find the people who are taking you seriously, make sure that they're that they are credentialed in what they do, right? And then reach out into those communities to find, because there will be somebody somewhere who can connect you. If I had not reached out in my moment of desperation to the Seeing Eye Guide Dog organization, we would have been labeled permanently crazy, both my son and I. Permanently.
Yeah, I guess my takeaway from that too is, go with your gut and accept help when it's offered.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And reach out.
Yeah.
You don't know who that person is, who's going to be the person who's going to be the connection that is going to help you find the person who's going to help you find the person. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like that's how it was for us. It was multiple connections through people before we got to where we needed to go. And
Right.
It's just ridiculous. No one should go through this over a visual impairment. You should be able to go to your local eye doctor and say, hey, notice my son doesn't seem to be recognizing faces or is, having trouble navigating. And just get, a diagnosis.
Right. It should not be that way. And hopefully, I know it's very unfortunately common, but hopefully as you continue your advocacy and others continue theirs, the medical world will catch up to this reality. And
well, we've made huge strides. And I would just like to talk about this, the Perkins School for the Blind and Dr. Lotfi Marabet at the Laboratory for Visual Neuroplasticity has worked tirelessly to acquire data on the prevalence of CVI, actual hard data. And it's really hard here in the US because of the way that our insurance system works and the way we collect data on epidemiology and all that stuff, right? Like who has what and how many. So they worked very hard, and this past year, for the very first time, the National Institute of Health has recognized CVI as an area of interest, which means that it now qualifies for research dollars for the very first time. The National Institute of Health has recognized CVI as the #1 cause of visual impairment in the developed world. So these are huge developments. And just a couple of weeks ago, Perkins hosted the Collaboration for Change CVI conference. And Dr. Michael Chiang, who is the director of the National Eye Institute, which is a division of the National Institute of Health, was there as the keynote speaker. So CVI is now on the NIH's radar, right?
Yeah.
And so things have changed considerably since we came on the scene in 2017. And for that, I'm incredibly grateful, because now I'm optimistic that we will have a diagnostic code sometime not too distant future. And that, I mean, because what I want is for universal screening. I think every 3-year-old needs to be screened, whether you think they need it or not.
100%. Like any visual screening, right? And hearing screening and any
Right.
other screening that we just give. And like
Right.
you yourself said, you were able to develop something rapidly as a music teacher without any education in this area at the time.
I did have the course on CVI. So yeah,
I
I did.
Of course. Okay. So you
Yeah,
had a
but
little
still,
bit of education.
I used a book and a pencil. So these are materials that are at hand, right? Yeah.
Right. And
But
so, I mean, I guess maybe that's the next step. That's your next crusade. And, as we round this up, and, I want to thank you for your tireless advocacy for your son and also for others, because it's obviously made an impact, not only for your family, but for other people out there, and will continue to make impact.
well, I hope so, because I just feel that there's just tens of thousands of people out there that don't know they have CVI yet, and they're suffering totally unnecessarily. And I hope that, every time I do this, that if you just find one more, that's just one less person who has to suffer unnecessarily. So that's why I'm here.
Yeah. And I hope that you continue to be here and here, doing this work in the world, and really appreciate your coming on the podcast and talking about your experience and being so candid about it.
Thank you. I so appreciate this opportunity, and it's been so wonderful to meet you and to get to talk with this about CVI with you and about the issues, that we experienced. And I'm just delighted. So thank you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure. And we'll put this in the show notes, but if you want to tell people where they can find you and this work, that would be great.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So my name is Stephanie Duesing, Dues, as in Sam, Ing. So if you Google my book, which is called Eyeless Mind, as in like the mind's eye, Eyeless Mind, a memoir about seeing and being seen. If you Google that, it'll take you to my website, or if you can remember my name, Stephanie Duesing, you can Google that too, and it'll take you to my website. And if you want to reach out to me, you can reach out to me through my website. There's a contact me there, and just send me an email. I'd be happy to talk with you if you have any questions. And yeah, that's where I'm at. And if you need further information about CVI, we're going to have some extensive show notes for you with lots of different resources. But if you're in a hurry right now, I would take a look at the Perkins School for the Blind has a fabulous CVI Now webpage, which is full of factual information about CVI. And it's very easy to understand for a parent or a new person just investigating this for the first time. And one of the very best factual sources of CVI is CVI Scotland, or www.cviscotland.org. And that source has got videos of what it's like to have CVI, what people see when they have CVI. And every person who has CVI has a different experience of their visual function. So you can't look at one video and think, oh, well, that's what everyone sees. Those are just some examples of what it can be like for CVI, but it's really helpful to be able to see that. And they have just tons of medically accurate scientific information about CVI that's presented in a very parent-friendly way. So it's a great place to get started if you're wondering if your child might be misdiagnosed, or if you're going, never thought autism really matched what we had here, whatever that is. So those are a couple of good places to start.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming on the show. And I know people are going to be excited to learn about this, even if they don't know anyone with CVI. This is a fascinating topic about human adaptation and the perseverance and love of a parent. So really appreciate all that you're doing, and we'll stop the recording now. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Hey everybody, it's Melissa, and I'm wondering if you all can relate. Have you ever caught yourself procrastinating, or maybe doubting your abilities, or maybe you have a black belt inner critic like I do or have had, that wants to sabotage your every move with judgment
and perfectionism expectations. It might keep you stuck, it might keep you anxious and away from your full potential. The Positive Intelligence Program, PQ, is a powerful 6-week journey designed to help you quiet those saboteurs, embrace positivity, and find flow in your life. Through daily practices and weekly focuses, we'll work together to build your mental fitness. The PQ app will guide you every step of the way and support you, and you'll be supported either by myself in a one-on-one or in a small group of like-minded individuals where you can share insights and progress. So reach out, contact me at info@thefullymindful.com to find out how we can work together one-on-one or in a small group today.